The OCP Critical Facilities Framework. This webinar will present the process called document management. We will start with the process overview and then provide you with some lessons learned through customer experiences and leave you with a few final notes to consider when working with this process. Let's start with looking at where document management belongs in the framework. The OCP CFOPS delivery model contains several different parts, and the document management belongs to site management and is one of those 9 processes. There is a different webinar that presents to you where to find the framework and how to download it and use it. It's free to use and modify and is shared through the OCP organization. The document management process is split into 2 groups of documentation. The first one is site policies that drive and control and govern the site operations, and the other one is the reference library that contains the up-to-date documentation, or if you like, the records of the current documentation for the site or sites in scope for the delivery. The aim of the document management process is to ensure that critical documentation that supports the site management processes and on-site services is always available for those who should have access to it. The materials that are stored in these different parts are of 3 different kinds. They can be master records that are used in one or several other processes, for example, asset lists or border lists. They can be templates for preparing day-to-day materials. That could be meeting agendas or service record templates or other types of reports to ensure that there is a consistent quality. And the third type are policy requirements on other processes. In this example, it's a cost distribution model that is used to explain how to split costs across, for example, different site system technologies or across different sites. So this means that if there are gaps in the site policies or the reference library, or if the information is old or wrong, that means that other processes will suffer because they will take decisions based on poor fundament. Therefore, this is a very critical process. If we go into the site policies and look what is contained in there, the first one is the site strategy. What does that mean? Well, that means what is the current site owner's strategy for the site. The life cycle for a critical facility is somewhere between 10 and 30 years typically. And that means when you design and build and start up a site, for the first 5 years, you may have a completely different focus and attention on certain things compared to 20, 25 years later. Then you might have another site strategy because you are getting closer to the decommissioning phase. So depending on where you are in the life cycle, the site strategy will shift. And this also means that your sourcing strategy for how to use your resources, whether they are in-house resources or if they are sourced externally, that will also shift over time. So the site strategy and its supporting sourcing strategy are an important overall governing document to help the management function to drive the site as effectively as possible, or efficiently if you like. The next one is the disaster recovery plan and emergency operating procedures. In an optimal world, you will never have any events or incidents or problems. The site will just function, but that of course rarely happens. You do get problems and incidents, and if you do not manage them well enough, you might even end up with a disaster, and that's when you need the disaster recovery to come back again to regular operations as soon as possible. But while being in the non-standard mode, you do need to have your emergency operating procedures documented, trained, and tested. You also need to have standard operating procedures for site management. So basically this OCP framework helps you define and structure your standard operating procedures through these processes. But they are of course unique for each site or each site owner, and you need to make sure that they're adapted for reality. So you should have these documented and clarified so that you minimize the risk of key person dependency. By having these standard operating procedures documented, you can train new people and you can exchange and flex the teaming, for example, due to illness or holidays and so forth. The fourth topic of the site policies is the cost distribution model. That is the way the site owner or site management function wants to budget and then follow up the accrued costs, regardless of if they are internally work in progress or work spent or external costs that come in as invoices. When they come in, some of them will obviously be tied to certain specific site systems, for example, whereas others will be more broadly applicable. And that is the question, how do you share those across the different things? Is it its own cost bucket that you have budgeted for and then can follow up? Or is it something that should be keyed out between different sites or between different systems? That's what the cost distribution model entails. And it's a good idea to make sure that this is aligned with the accounting policies and the financial controllers of the organization. On-site work rules is an important part, which might be easy to forget. It's a very hands-on practical documentation that should be distributed and posted so that it's always readily available for on-site works. One of the main or critical topics is to ensure that health and safety rules are applied to avoid accidents or even deaths. But it also covers such topics as security requirements and certifications and qualifications, and maybe rules on escorting and other parts for what is applied when performing on-site work. The last one relates to the organizations of the stakeholders involved in providing the site operations. And the first thing to consider here is that it's not only the demand organization and supply organization or the site owner and the site management function and the vendors or service suppliers that provide the, for example, maintenance and other on-site services. You should also consider other external stakeholders that could be the public services for fire prevention that needs to be connected to make sure that they can align with the disaster recovery plan, for example. And you need to have the contact lists for 24/7 access to the different service providers in case of incidents, but also the regular organizations for the normal demand and supply, which means that you are in control of where to escalate issues or matters for decision on the tactical level and strategic level. An example here from a customer with a lesson learned was that a global ICT provider that owned a portfolio of several sites in 2 countries, they were unsure how to manage this portfolio going forward. They had procured the design and build for several years ago, and they had been operating them, and they were sort of halfway through the life cycle in principle. So they were 10, 15 years old, and the question was, should we upgrade and refurbish and look at our generation shift for the coming years in our service organization and keep this in-house? Or is this the opportunity where we should sell off our sites to an external third party that then will provide the sites, including site operations, back to us? Or should we look at actually decommissioning this and move our IT services to a third-party co-location and just ignore the sites altogether and be one of several hosted ICT providers? So the question was where to go, and were these the options, or were there other alternatives? What would be the benefits and the risks of these? The company in this case, they provided an engagement for some advisory consultants, and they assessed the business options, not only from these commercial standpoints, but also from technical standpoints. And they performed several management workshops. They made thorough technical audits of the sites in scope and looked at the agreements and border lists and so forth, and the SLAs that were expected by the management of the site owner. And the result of this work was a recommended sourcing strategy that supported the refreshed 5-year site strategy to continue to secure the provisioning of IT services. So in this case, the site owner concluded that they would have a problem setting a strategy that would be longer than 5 years because of the speed of change in their industry, as well as the age of their portfolio of sites. But after this engagement, at least they had a clear sourcing strategy which supported a 5-year site strategy to continue the work. And whether that conclusion was to outsource or keep it in-house or have a hybrid model, that is not so relevant. The point is the importance of having a site strategy and a supporting sourcing strategy based on what the business demand actually is. If we look at the second part, the reference library, that is where we find the up-to-date documentation, or should find the up-to-date records of what is going on at the site, but also for off-site services. So here we find the agreements for external suppliers that provide services and solutions and site systems. It may be internal agreements between different departments with SLAs and other things. So this could be both internal and external, but the important thing is that it clarifies the border lists and who is responsible for what. The next one is the as-built drawings. When you design and commission a site, you go through thorough technical testing and integrated acceptance tests and all these things. And that includes also to have the appropriate drawings that actually reflect reality. You also have for example, soil studies and other types of examinations that you store together with these. As the life cycle continues and you have the site running for a couple of years, there will be changes, upgrades, refurbish projects and so forth. You will have added network capacity perhaps, and changed capacity for the environmental controls, upgrades in the security systems and so forth. This means that there will be changes in the live environment, and that needs to be reflected also in the documentation, which means the as-built drawings, for example, needs to be updated if the power distribution is changed or developed. So do we have the latest single line diagrams in place where we can find them? That is sort of the key question for this one as an example. But it also leads to the asset lists being updated and changed as assets are being removed or upgraded, replaced, or new assets are added as the capacity is built out. And the asset list is not just a simple record of what do we have in scope for the service delivery. It should actually also describe the fundamental technical things, such as when was this site system or site system component installed or commissioned, what are the warranties, what's the vendor's expected end of life for these assets, as well as what is its current condition and the expected change out forecast for this, which might be something different than the technical end of life from the vendor. So, and this ties back to the financial management and the budgeting process of the assets. And as you buy site systems, you also get warranties and compliance certificates and all these things. And many of these needs to be stored in original to be valid and useful when claiming your rights towards the suppliers of these solutions. And to be able to operate the site properly, you need to know how to optimize the systems and how to set their parameters to work well under their operating conditions. And that's the configurations or the site configuration procedures, which also leads to the need for manuals and vendor instructions. And these, of course, change over time, and you have updates and upgrades to the software and these things, and all those things need to follow when it comes to the documentation part. Otherwise, there will be problems when reality doesn't match what you have in your records. And how to perform the maintenance or operate the on-site systems is what you describe in the method statements. But these could also cover other things, for example, the health and safety rules for how to perform a risk assessment before you start working in the live environment, and it could be other things. But when you do on-site works, you should have method statements that are pre-approved by the site management function or the site owner. That means if it's a specific project, that the method statements may have to be developed for that project. But if you have a recurring, for example, monthly test of the gensets, that is a pre-approved method statement that is kept in the records and can be reused every month if it's the same. And when you perform your work on site, you need to document what you've done, why, and the time and materials used, and so forth. And that goes into the service records that should follow the templates decided for the sites in scope. And finally, we have the meetings and decision records. There will be a lot of different meetings, both regular recurring meetings and ad hoc meetings where decisions are taken, and there will be decisions taken outside meetings. All of these needs to be documented to make sure that you can go back and refer to that this was decided at this day, so therefore we follow these. Or it might be worse, something is decided and hasn't been followed, at least then you can go back and say, look, it's been decided, it should be followed. So we have some lessons learned here, and this was a painful lesson learned for a site owner. It was a telecom operator, and they wanted to challenge their current maintenance provider that had been servicing their base stations and other technical nodes for several years. And when the telecom operator collected the tender materials with the supporting documents, for example, the asset list, of course, it also turned out that when they looked at the site configuration procedures and the method statements for how to maintain these, it turned out that a lot of them were missing, and some of them were there, but they were obsolete. So they referred to old systems that have been replaced, or they were not complete. So they challenged their provider and asked why that wasn't up to date and in place, and the supplier simply stated that there was no contractual obligation for them to provide those things. That was the site owner's responsibility. And they also reminded the telecom operator that there was a tough negotiation during the tender for this maintenance contract a few years back, where there was a strong focus on price. And this was one of the areas where the supplier could save some costs, but expected the site owner then to take responsibility for this. Now, the site owner did not have the competence or capacity to do that. So what they did was, before they launched this tender, they added the requirements for a new service provider to review and update the current reference library and the records to make sure that they met best practices and the customer expectations. And they also added service levels that were defined to ensure that there were penalties in place in case these service records were not kept up to date over time. So that was a way of handling this, where the site owner saw that they could improve the document management process through this tender round. Some final notes on this process then. This is one of the two fundamental processes that all other site management processes rely on. And I think it's quite obvious when you look at this and see that if the documents are not properly recorded, then of course the other processes will have a hard time making real assessments or taking real decisions. If you don't have the right data, then you can't take the right decisions. And that is why this is one of the two fundamental processes. The other one is to monitor and report, or the monitoring and reporting process. That one collects data from the different systems and different aspects of the site operations within energy and resource use, within availability and quality and risk and so forth. So combining the data from the monitoring and reporting with the up-to-date records of the document management makes the other processes possible to be effective. So this means that you should have a system in place to keep these document management records well organized and up to date. Accurate information should be readily available to anyone in the organization that needs access. Otherwise, you will have problems. And don't forget that this applies not only for the operational level, but also for the technical and strategic level. When they take decisions or issue policies or change governing principles, this needs to be captured in order to make sure that it actually is being used in the site operations. And a small note on the final note on standard operating procedures for site management. In some organizations, they use the standard operating procedures, or SOP, both for site management and for on-site services. They don't split between these things. So it's important to make sure that when having dialogues with other stakeholders, that if they say standard operating procedures, that they actually mean it, the SOPs for site management, and they don't refer to the on-site services. If they do, that would be referred to as method statements in this Open Compute project framework. Hoping you will join us for another webinar on the other processes.